Gavin. How are you?
I'm perfectly well, Jezreel. How are you?
I'm very well, Gavin. I'm very well. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay, so Gavin, this year we're talking about stories as the main theme, and I know you love stories because I've experienced so many of your creative stories, and a lot of the stories that you create, sometimes I'm not sure whether they're real or whether they're imagined. And so, let's start with like your preference then. What kind of stories do you prefer? Do you prefer real factual based stories, or do you prefer made up stories? And also, I know that your background as a scientist, being a scientist and being kind of involved in a lot of research that is based on logic and rationality, how does that relate to the kind of stories that you may feel that are most important in your life?
That is a great question. Real or imaginary stories, which ones do I prefer? I guess the question is there a difference? Is there a difference between a real or imaginary story? Whilst one is based on something that actually happened, it has the same weight. If you are a great storyteller, they can have the same amount of weight to them. The idea that one is based on something that you may have personally experienced and one that you just imagined happening does not necessarily mean that there's less of an emotional connection to both you as the storyteller and for what the audience themselves can empathize with. So I tend to not try to distinguish between a story that one's based on my own personal experience and one that is not. I try to, whenever I tell a story, be completely present and immersed in the story and take the person there with me as well. So it shouldn't have as much of an impact with the story itself, whether or not it's based on a real life event or a made up one. But post-story conversation, sometimes you tell a story and then you discuss and bring up and talk about it. That is where it does matter. When you do have something that's based on truth, you can delve into depth about the background behind the story and what led up to that event in real life, or in a made up story, what inspired you to make up that story. And that is where I think the distinction happens in that post-story conversation.
From my experience of having heard so many of your stories, I've known you for 7 years now, believe it or not. And so over that 7-year period, I've heard so many of your stories, and I can tell that fun is very important to you. Creativity is very important to you. Humor is really important to you. So I've kind of like been able to identify your values, but not so much about your identity. I know that you are a scientist, but that doesn't always come through in your stories. In your stories, it's like I still don't know. I know what your values are. I know, how you that you have like you experiment with the way you use language, and that's probably similar to experimenting in science, like wondering like what if I do this, and making kind of connections that didn't exist previously. But I still don't know who you are, even though I know your story. So that's because most of the stories that I've heard you tell, it seems as though they're made up rather than real.
It probably goes down to how I tell the story. And so I've told a lot of true stories that normally lends to people believing that due to the way I've told them or the way I've tried to place a spin on them, that they're not necessarily real. And sometimes one thing I do like to do in storytelling is use hyperbole, to take something and then just over exaggerate that aspect and a certain aspect of the story or of a character or an individual. But the story itself, the central premise, has a lot of truth to it. And so I think with my stories, I tend to like to give the audience or people listening something to think about and something to consider and something to take home with them. But also, I try to base a lot of my stories on something that may have actually happened, or has most likely happened, has some nugget of truth or some event in my life that I can really pin down and then take back to people. And that's what I try to give to everyone.
And like in terms of approaches, it's like there's the social science approach and there's the natural science approach to how we find out information. And also, I suppose, it colors the kind of stories that we tell. So being kind of a scientist and doing your research in a particular way, do you think that has shaped the way you imagine your stories?
Yes and no. So with my stories, with my background, I guess, in science, one of the things is that you tend to go into a lot of detail on a very specific niche subject that not many people have understanding with. And even when you explain your topic to people in a broader sense of your subject, they may not know the intricacies of what you're trying to tell. And it's all about how do you convey a complex idea or something to your audience, and how do you have stages depending on the person's background to what they can relate to your story. And that's what I tried to bend into my storytelling with, as an aspect of the story. What stage do I think the audience is at, to determine how I tell the story or how it describes the aspect I want to describe. And I use as much techniques as I can. Analogies is something that I really try to stick to, and how to try and convey a complicated idea to make it something that someone else can understand.
So if we look at the link between identity, values, and behaviors, what do you think goes, do you think that it's our identity that shapes our behavior, or do you think it's our behavior that shapes our identity?
I would say it's not really a one-way street. It's more like a circle. And so your identity will shape your behavior, which will go back to shape your identity. And they're constantly evolving and growing depending on the environment you're in, the people you associate with, the information you're intaking. And this is constantly adapting and changing both those aspects.
And again, like from the social science perspective, it's like we rely very much on the context, whereas because everything takes place with it's complex. Things that are there in our environment, both our internal kind of internal experience or interpretation of our experiences, and the external environment shapes our reality. Whereas in the science world, we look more for objective things that we can repeat, objective associations and connections that we can make generalizations from. How do you think that there is a difference in our approach of like the complexity that is entailed?
I think there can be, but there doesn't necessarily have to be. I guess for me, in my background, one tenet that I always tell myself, or something whenever I'm thinking of an idea or how to address it, is just a universal truth that I use as a staging ground to base everything else off of. 1 + 1 = 2. Whenever I have a problem, I always tell myself 1 + 1 = 2. And from there, I can use that as a staging off ground to say, if that's true, then this is true, and this is true. And just build up and construct like a sentence or whatever that I need to from that central level.
And you see, when you talk about 1 + 1 = 2, as a social scientist, people will say, well, not always, and that can kind of really annoy those who are saying, based like, well, yes, of course, it's always 2. And the social scientists will say, no, it's not always 2. It's subject to interpretation. There are many, subjective interpretations around that. So how do we reconcile these two words, one of the subjective interpretations and one of like objective generalizations that can be made?
I think there has to be a point of agreement between the two different schools or mindsets. There has to be one, for me, that's a personal staging ground. But if say in a social science background, that's not necessarily the case, then try to find an area of commonality that you can both go, okay, we can all agree that this is true. And then from that, build up and build a staging ground and try to find more commonality, even just trying to understand where the other person is coming from and going, this is why you believe this because of what we've agreed upon. And this is why the other side believes that because of what we agree upon. And from that understanding, it's not necessarily reaching a point of agreement, but reaching a point of understanding that there is validity in both possible approaches and mindsets.
Mhm. Okay. Another thing that we have in common is that, well, I lived in London for a long time, and I know you were born in London, weren't you? Were you born in London?
Yes.
Yeah. So when I lived in London, I always thought of myself as a Londoner, and that was my identity. I considered myself to be a Londoner. And although we both live in Birmingham, I know that over the last 7 years, a couple of times I've asked you, do you like living in Birmingham, or words to that effect, because I have never settled into Birmingham, because my identity is still as a Londoner, and I don't identify with being a Brummie in any shape or form at all. So you see, that kind of sense of identity can be linked to our sense of belonging. How have you been able to feel, do you feel that you belong in Birmingham, or do you feel that you belong in London? And has it kind of, has your identity shifted in some way since you've been in Birmingham?
Yes and no. One of the beliefs I have is wherever I go, I belong. As such, if it's in Birmingham, I belong. When I'm back in London, I belong. And I try to convey the ideas. The idea with, I guess, the Brahmi identity is just what do you experience in each individual city? What do you experience in London? What do you experience in Birmingham? And then when you talk to people from outside the area, one thing that I think gives me a greater sense with Birmingham is talking to someone who's not from there about the places in Birmingham, about all the different things that are available to them. And they go, wow, this person's really knowledgeable of this area. And the same with London. It just goes from experience in those areas and the different attractions that are there.
Yeah, so it's you've always created this impression of being a very positive and resourceful person, and that belief of I belong wherever I am, that's a very powerful belief. And I can imagine that because our beliefs shape our behavior, and so your identity is, like you said before, it's not a linear correlation. It's not a linear association between identity, values, and behaviors. It's a cyclical relationship, isn't it? And so that belief that you have will shape your identity. Your identity is more malleable rather than concrete. And it's like, no, I am a Londoner. It's like, I can't be anything else. That's a very rigid kind of belief. And I can see how having a rigid belief about our identity can make us feel like circles and square pegs, basically, that we're always kind of like feeling an outsider wherever we are. Whereas that's the beauty of stories, that stories can be molded and shaped in a way that a concrete fact, it can become very rigid, can't it?
And I think just to add to that, one other point of addressing is also stories. When it comes to belonging, where do most of your stories stem from? Is it I was in London when this happened, or was it I was in this other place where this happened? And when you see that transition where your stories come from, that I think can also aid in the appearance of belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And also, what is the quality of the stories? Because when I lived in Spain, when I lived in Italy, some of the stories that I have about the years that I spent in those countries, they're very powerful. I traveled a lot, and so the traveling, the adventure, the excitement, all of those, it kind of, I suppose, in a way, that creates a sense of belonging as well. It depends on what our values are, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so, in terms of what is mysterious about this connection between stories, creativity, and culture, what for you is unknown about this? What is it that you still feel that there needs to be exploration? We don't know what what the power, how are stories so powerful for us?
I think with that, it's just about experience. Whenever with storytelling and how it again affects your behavior identity and how it can be a reflection on cultures and the like, it's just about experiencing and hearing more stories. It's just about getting the stories from other areas, other places. And one thing as well that I do is whatever story I hear, I take a little something from them. And it's about trying to get out there and get as many stories around the world as possible and take from them as much as you can. And that will broaden not just your understanding, but the understanding of everyone else you talk to about all these different identities and cultures.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it, isn't it? Because like we have our own world in which we have our own story, and then we can broaden that world by synchronizing with somebody else's story and seeing, you know, where we're at in that other person's story. And I think that's something to be explored, isn't it? It's like, I know my own story and I know how you are positioned in my story, but I don't know how I'm positioned in your story. And it's like, who am I in the stories of people that I know? You know, that's kind of mysterious, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we don't know. It's like, I mean, there may be so many people that we've only known for a short while, and then they've kind of moved on, gone away, but they might remember us for decades, and we will never know that they do.
Yes, yes. It's always interesting meeting someone who you maybe don't remember having such an impact on, but they always remember you, talk about that time when they met or something you did that sticks with them. And it's always brings a smile to my face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tell me about the stories that have really kind of constructed and shaped your life, like from, you know, from when you were living in London. What is the story that has brought you here?
It's hard to pin down just one story, but there's been so many stories or incidents of my time. One thing that I think brings back time is just in London, it was growing up, it was all the different aspects of growing up to become who you are, the visions you have of the future, and just time spent with the people around you. One aspect I remember was just me and a group of friends would go for lunch at a fish and chip shop and play cards. And in that time, we just tell stories of the time, of our past, everything such as that. And it was just that continual storytelling and memories that I'd have. And it was a honing stage where among the small group of friends, the stories that would really stick out, would really be memorable and such, I would pass on and reiterate in future places and instances in my life. And hearing one story I love to talk about is the story of how I chose to go to Birmingham and study at university there, and how the wind magically blew onto a page on a subject book, and I read the subject that I wanted to study, and it completely changed my vision of myself.
Wow, that is powerful. Yeah, that is really powerful. So that, you know, when you talk about the wind blowing, it's like it's as though the external reality kind of communicates with us. You know, it's as though like the wind and, you know, things in nature, they find a way of giving us a meaning, right? Symbolically, metaphorically.
Yeah, well, symbolically, yes, and it's again with my storytelling, it's a bit of the story addition to it. I know personally it probably wasn't the wind that blew over the page, because I folded the page over a certain way, and because of that, I know that it was likely to fold back at a certain point in place. But it just felt at the time, and it felt, and how I love to envision it for other people is that the page just turned over like there was a wind that blew it to the right place and the right subject.
That's the story around it. And, you know,
Yes.
the fact is X and Y happened, you know, the page, what you've just said. And, but that, you know, if you just told us, well, you turned over the page, that's just a fact. There's nothing interesting about it, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And it paints the magic of the whole situation, and also how important it was to myself personally.
You see, there again, it's like the scientist versus the social scientist. It's like, you know, how much do we want to be influenced by what we, you know, think is magical, you know, and
Yes.
how much do we want to be logical and rather than magical?
Exactly. It's finding the right time to do a bit of both.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, because I think people like Leonardo da Vinci and a lot of like these geniuses, they are not only logical, they're also magical as well, aren't they?
Yes, yes. Seeing what they've done and accomplished can only be described as magical.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Well, Gavin, I've really enjoyed speaking with you and it's been very stimulating. So thank you very much. And I'll
Thank
speak.
you very much for the night.
Thank you. Bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.